Holy crap, look! And it was a perfect triangle just floating across the sky, way up there.
I think it was a spaceship of some sort.
Aliens, first thing that I thought, but it scared the heck out of me.
There was a lot of talk about the Tic Tac actually being U.S. technology. And that is very interesting to me because you ask the pilots and they say there is no possibility that that could be a technology we've made.
If something doesn't look right, we have to revise the way we think about reality, you know?
Jacques, in discussing, he started talking about some of these materials that he had from UAP. Why would somebody alter magnesium? And it doesn't sound like something you would go throwing around a beach in Brazil.
When people claim they know what this is about, whether it's some kind of fraud or it's some kind of mechanism, my eyes just roll. You either don't know what you're talking about or you're lying.
I can't tell you what's going on, but I can tell you this. If we ever figure it out, it's going to change the world.
I'd say there's a couple hundred of these slides in here. We could just go through them one after the other and just look at images. I am looking at pictorial targets that were likely used for remote viewing subjects to test their remote viewing capacities. Remote viewing was a kind of military lingo for what an earlier period would have called clairvoyance, essentially seeing what's happening at a distance. And the US government and various US intelligence agencies got very interested in these capacities in the 1970s. And it's partly because the Soviet Union was interested. And so there was a kind of parapsychological space race. Intelligence agencies basically trained a number of military professionals to become clairvoyant spies on the Soviet Union. That's essentially what remote viewing is. Russell Targ is a laser physicist. He worked with another physicist named Hal Puthoff. They're the ones who ran the remote viewing program.
Hal Puthoff, he's in his 80s now. He has been involved a long, long time doing studies on remote viewing, all of it for the government. He knows a lot. He's a deep insider.
The person who really led that program after Russell stepped down donated 50 to 100 boxes of declassified material. It's all right here.
Operation Stargate, the CIA's so-called psychic spying program, went on for about 20 years, and its budget got cut during the Clinton administration when the post-Cold War atmosphere was producing budget cuts in the military and intelligence. And there is a debate to this day over the validity of the results that emerged from Stargate.
They would put these in a slide machine, they'd throw the image up on the slide, and they would ask the remote viewer who would be in another room or another building what was the image up on the screen at that moment. And they would have some system for determining whether it was a hit, a miss, or a near miss, or a near hit.
People think that's all, bogus, but it's not. If you look at the actual studies and read the documents, remote viewing got great results.
Essentially, it's the idea that we live in this infinitely entangled universe at the quantum level. Psychic espionage is really just a matter of indexing a kind of a place in time-space that allows the psyche of the investigator to target that.
I'm Hal Putoff from Stanford University, PhD in quantum electronics. Remote viewing, in the old days, used to call remote viewing ESP. That is the ability of people to sense things or to pick up information from remote locations or hidden locations and so on. I wasn't particularly interested in the topic. It was only because there's an individual who had demonstrated the ability to, quote, see inside a device, the very high-tech magnetometer at Stanford University. And so this fellow by the name of Ingo Swann was asked to demonstrate his ability, and he did. It's absolutely amazing. To me as a physicist, I can't imagine, anything like this occurring. Well, suddenly the CIA descended on my doorstep, and they said, "Oh, have we been looking for you?" And I said, "Why? What'd I do?" And he said, "Well, we saw that early in your career you were a naval intelligence officer, you used to be an NSA, saw I was at SRI, and I was a physicist instead of a psychologist," which they took to be a plus. And they saw that this experiment had occurred, and they said, "What we're dealing with is that Russians have been spending millions of dollars at their best institutes with some of their best people for years on, quote, ESP research. So we're wondering, would you be willing to set up a small program to look into it?" So I founded the program in '72. And it turned out there were remote viewers who were able to see into hidden places and remote locations with some degree of accuracy. I mean, not 100%, but more than an ordinary physicist could seemingly account for. And so we agreed to do a series of experiments.
Here, the experiment is repeated, this time with Putoff as a sender. This is the drawing that Geller has made to correspond to the target object. As you can see, he is quite elated about getting the right answer. Here in the laboratory notebook, on the left side of the page, you see the original target, and on the right, Geller's responses. This is not a collection of correct answers out of a long series of correct and incorrect responses. This is actually the total run of pictures in a series. It is interesting that there is often a mirror symmetry.
I was at SRI before them working on the ARPANET, which became the Internet. SRI had machine number 2 on the Internet, okay? So it was a significant place at the time in software development for what became, the Internet. The director of our branch came into my office, closed the door, and said there is a proposal to do parapsychology research at SRI. He said, "Let me draw you a picture." And he went to my whiteboard and he drew a scale. On one side, he put a big cube and he wrote $100 million, which was his budget. And then he put a little dot here that said $1 million, which was a research that Putoff and Tag wanted to do parapsychology. And he said, "We're going to jeopardize $100 million of research with IBM, AT&T, Intel, Xerox, major corporate America companies, by doing this research on parapsychology where, we may be subject to a lot of ridicule, we may not find anything." And he said, "You've been able to keep your reputation in science, when studying UFOs, how did you do it? And I said, well, the solution may be to keep that research classified, not because there were big secrets, for the next atom bomb, but because if you announce it on day one, everybody is going to attack us. We should let Puthoff and Targ run a laboratory here. It became an extraordinary program at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, on remote viewing.
We ended up training Army intelligence remote viewers to learn to tap into this. And so that's how the whole remote viewing program took off. One of our very first operational cases that we did for the CIA was they wanted to know about a research facility in the Soviet Union. Semipalatinsk was the name of it. We had no idea what was there, but we had a really good remote viewer. So we just gave him coordinates and said, tell us what you see there. He drew a giant crane, he said it was so large, and ran over the top of a building and said that they were building these giant spheres there, 60 foot in diameter. And so he gave a really terrific description, and turned out the information was really quite accurate. So the CIA spent a week having him wander through this facility in the Soviet Union, describing everything he saw. And so it was evaluated by a number of elements of the agency and other outside contractors, and they were absolutely amazed. That was a major thing. Another critical one was that there was a Libyan pilot who flew Soviet airplanes, and he was going to turn the plane over to us. But after he was in the air, he got cold feet. And he realized, oh my God, the KGB will, chase me the rest of my life. So he just bailed out of the plane, and he said, okay, I had a problem with the plane, I just bailed out. So the plane just ran till it ran out of gas and crashed in Africa.
Shortly after Carter left the presidency, he was addressing a group of students at Emory University in Atlanta, and he related the account of how a Soviet spy plane had crashed in Central Africa, and this spy plane contained lots of valuable espionage technology. So there were recon teams from both the US side and the Soviet side that were racing to find this wreckage and either secure it or procure it.
When President Carter was briefed on the plane going down, Stan Turner, who was the CIA director, said, well, we've got these remote viewers, maybe they can find the plane. So we put 2 of our best remote viewers on it. Long story short, they made an X on a map that was within 3 miles of where that plane crashed. So the CIA was able to go in and get the plane, of course, before the Russians even knew where it was. So those are the kind of operational things that we would do as they came up. Data that, in fact, the Russians were doing exactly this kind of stuff. In fact, when the CIA came to me at SRI and said, we'd like for you to look into this, they plopped a telephone-sized book down on my desk that was full of Russian work in this area. And so that's why they knew that they took it seriously.
Afterwards, Carter was subjected to mockery, the notion that you could believe that this remote viewing program had actually produced actionable intelligence was held up to ridicule. But of course, Carter is a nuclear engineer. He's speaking from a place of informed inquiry. He is at the top level of executive oversight. He has access to the information. This is obviously an informed account. But it's very easy for an observer to just say, oh, there goes old Jimmy again talking about little green men or what have you. It's the easiest thing in the world.
the stigma that was originally, forefront for things like ESP research, remote viewing, UFO research, and so on, was very high back in, the 60s and 70s. But because now it's become clear, and much of the information in both the remote viewing program that was highly classified and in the UAP program that was highly classified, since much of that has been declassified, is now available to the public, scientists are beginning to realize that, well, there appears to be more to this than we thought.
When people say that the government had no interest in UFOs and UAP, we think, well, we know that they were interested in psychic abilities and experimenting with LSD and psychedelics and all sorts of weird and wonderful things from decades ago. Why wouldn't they be interested in UFOs and UAP?
What's really fascinating about that is the overlap between the people who were part of these programs back in like the 70s and the UFO community as it exists now. The people whose names most people will know that are still in the community, are still going on podcasts, are still talking about this. A lot of them were involved in these remote viewing programs decades ago.
I tend in the direction that if there were a major planetary UAP event that forced all governments and all peoples to realize that this is an absolutely real thing, I'm of the opinion that it'd be more likely to unite our viewpoints than to result in panic. These UAP events are definitely beyond our engineering, but not beyond our physics. I made a list of what are all the weird things that people have claimed associated with observation of UAP. And there are a lot of weird things. And suppose Einstein's equations for general relativity, black holes and astrophysics, to access those things that general relativity says that in principle you could with warp drive and wormholes and all that kind of stuff, takes enormous amounts of concentrated energy and infinitesimal volumes, and we just don't have that. So I would say it's not beyond our physics. We can understand the physics, but it's definitely beyond our engineering. So given that that's the case, that's another reason why I think the source of the phenomena is not black programs in Russia, China, or the US, but really from some other source.
Oh my God, what was that?
So, do you see yourself these days as a believer?
Am I a believer in UFO? I mean, it's such a funny word. To a scientist, do I have data that makes me think there's something there of value to examine and come to grips with? Absolutely. Does that make me, quote, a believer? Well, I mean, for a scientist, it's data that counts, not opinion about the data. So we need more data.
Looking at remote viewing and even how the government viewed it as successful, if not scientifically understood, it makes me think of the brain scans given to Gary Nolan of various military personnel who experienced UFO or UAP events. He was looking at changes to the part of the brain that could possibly be linked to intuition. I guess what I'm getting at is, are some of us special in some way?
I think the human being is the ultimate special effects projector. I think human beings are able to project special effects, real special effects, into the physical environment and often change things physically. And that's why I always say I think the human is really the superhuman, but on a kind of unconscious, kind of unaware level. What remote viewing or precognition or any of these abilities strongly imply is that we can actually get information from great distances in space or time.
You would think that there must be special people that are able to do this. In fact, what we found was it's sort of a bell curve. So just like with athletic ability or music ability, everyone seems to have this to some degree. I mean, you got superstars at one end of the bell curve and duds at the other end, but to some degree, anyone could be trained.
Well, okay, that's, what do you do with that? I mean, that radically shifts what you think a human being is. And I think that's why it's resisted. If you study religion, you know, there are a number of what I would call universals in the sense that they happen everywhere as far as we can see back. And one of the most common religious rituals is divination, the ability to know what's going to happen before it happens. Modern writers are very gifted at explaining their own experiences. The person I always write about is Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens, was viciously funny and critical of everything, but he was completely convinced that he had had these precognitive experiences. He called it mental telegraphy. Because he knew if he wrote about it, it would be made fun of. And so there's this really funny moment where he gives this essay called Mental Telegraphy to a very famous magazine in the 19th century, and he asks that they publish it anonymously. And you can just see the editor going like, you're Mark Twain, I'm not gonna do that. The precognitive dream he relates is actually about his brother's death. It's not a happy event, it's a tragic event. He linked this phenomenon to his own literary creativity, by the way. He got ideas for stories through channels that were not normal. But he didn't have some kind of religious model for it. He just felt this was part of reality, part of what he did.
You've written about this idea of other dimensions or realms from the very beginning, but it was fiction, right?
I wrote a book called Subespace, and it got the Jules Verne Prize in France. But the idea was that a group of scientists in France were aware of strange lights that were seen outside, but they also came inside houses and inside buildings, and they couldn't understand what those were. This is 1961, 1962. I wanted to posit the concept that those were not necessarily ETs, that it was something else. It turns out that today, people are seeing globes of light. They become material when they are here. The rest of the time, they are not material, which is why they can go through this wall. And they can transform into lights, or they can transform into globes, into balls of light. Not in our normal universe, but in a subset of the universe that I call subspace. And these creatures exist in subspace, and they can come into our world through a number of different media, some of which are flying saucers. This is a debate that people are beginning to have now in the United States.
Jacques Vallée has been the primary person who's brought up, let's have a broader viewpoint, that maybe it isn't just ETs coming from some galaxy far away, maybe it's interdimensional. Whether it's interdimensional, time travelers from the future, or maybe some sequestered group hiding out below the seabed or something. I think we have to open up our mental telescope to take in more than just, wayfarers coming from other galaxies.
There's a lot of different versions of the interdimensional hypothesis. That's a tough one because we don't actually know what other dimensions are or if they even exist. It's kind of like string theory and quantum theory, but we don't actually have any proof that they exist. They just kind of help us solve problems at this point. And so that hypothesis can kind of take any weirdness that you put on it.
I was studying advanced physics for a PhD, and the advanced physics says there are more than 4 dimensions. There are more than just time and space. And there may be other universes. I mean, this is classical physics. It's not science fiction. They don't relate it to UFOs, but maybe they should, at some point.
I think that actually one of the biggest secrets about the UFO phenomenon is that it's not about craft and technology, that the people who know the most about it and have been doing this the longest, the thing that they're actually interested in is consciousness and human potential, that those are the things that they care about the most.
There's a convergence today between the question of UFOs and the question of extraphysical experience. When I was growing up, the outlook on UFOs, if one took seriously the UFO thesis, was, well, maybe they're ET craft, and what would it take for some kind of mechanical vehicle to span such distances? But in the past few decades, I would say that the thesis around UFO phenomena, if one takes seriously that it's something that goes outside of ordinary observation, is that these experiences might be from different intersections of time or different dimensions, which when first said sounds very, very far out. But we've known since the age of Einstein that time is conditional, that one has to logically account for the existence of an infinitude of simultaneous events. People will talk about cosmic wormholes, whereby you introduce some exotic matter into a mix of events and you're able to bend space-time. These are all just conceptual models, but it seems to me that the concepts are better developed around interdimensionality than they are around extraterrestriality, which doesn't mean that only one thing is happening. There could be a whole complexity of things that are occurring. The fact is, if we are experiencing evidence from academic psychical research, ESP research, that the psyche is capable of receiving and transmitting information in anomalous ways that may indicate the capacity of the psyche to travel among different intersections of time from which that information presumably emanates. That is possibly parallel to exactly what's going on when people report UFO encounters or abduction experiences. So part of the complexity of human nature is that we are all conditioned to think in terms of magic bullet theories behind events, as though to say there's just one antecedent, and if we can find that, we'll get to the truth. Whereas there's probably a complexity of antecedents.
I was very into space. I wanted to go to the moon. I wanted to be with NASA, every bit of that. In college, I started out in astrophysics, but then I spent a summer working in the hospital or in the operating room as an orderly, and I really fell in love with taking care of patients. My dad, of course, was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, and so I knew how much he loved working with patients, and he loved neurosurgery. In the back of my mind, I thought, well, I'll go to medical school, but I'm not going to go into neurosurgery. That lasted until I did a neurosurgery rotation for 2 weeks, and I fell in love with it. And, I've never looked back. You go in, and in one day, with your hands, you try to affect someone's life for the better. Probably every 2 or 3 months, I would hear fairly compelling stories of near-death experiences or shared death or after-death communications that should have gotten my attention. But I kept dismissing them, thinking, no, that's wishful thinking. We don't have any way of proving that. No, we don't seem to have memories of past lives. I don't know that I believe in reincarnation. Certainly having my own personal experience went light years towards opening me up to accepting and admitting this beautiful kind of expansion in our knowledge of ourselves and the universe. It was such a mundane day. It was one of the most unremarkable days you can imagine, other than just being a beautiful family day. But then, 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, all of that changed very dramatically, very quickly.
What exactly was the diagnosed condition you had, and what is the prognosis for that condition?
Well, I had, it was a gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis, basically the worst kind of meningitis to have. For E. coli meningitis, the numbers are well up there, over 50% for the people who die from it. But it's especially bad for people who, for example, spend a week in coma, like I did. In fact, when the 3 doctors who wrote the case report, they sent it to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases for publication September 2018, the peer-reviewed scientific editor said, wait a minute, this case is absurd. Nothing like this precedes it in the medical literature. How do you explain this recovery? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. So it all started in a very primitive way. There came a slowly spinning white light. This white light had fine silvery and golden tendrils, and it came towards me, very slowly spinning. And as it did so, I realized that it came with a perfect musical melody. The first time it happened, the light portal took me up into this brilliant, ultra-real Gateway Valley. It had many Earth-like features. I mean, there was this meadow that was lush and fertile and beautiful, surrounded by forest, waterfalls and the crystal blue ponds, beautiful billowing clouds of pure color against a blue-black velvety sky. Thousands of beings dancing down in this meadow. I had no body awareness at any point. I was simply an observer. And what I observed, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies. They were looping and spiraling in these vast formations. And the best part about it, as I've said, I wasn't alone. You feel that, like a big hello from this God force of pure love. I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And that happened. I would just tumble back down. But it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody that I could conjure up that light portal and these spiritual realms.
What is your first memory coming out of the coma?
The actual kind of awakening that my family witnessed, where I was fighting the ventilator, and then when they pulled the breathing tube out, I said, thank you. I have only the vaguest glimmer of a memory of that, although my youngest sister, Phyllis, who was there, told me I did very shortly, like literally within 10 or 20 minutes of the breathing tube coming out. She said I was sitting there on the bed, looking around at everyone in the room, and I would look them in the eyes and say, don't worry, all is well. What I'd been through was astonishing. I wanted to tell everybody about it. But my doctors were trying to tell me, oh, yes, you were very sick. Your brain was soaking in pus. We don't even know how you're coming back to us now, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. I just thought, okay, hallucination, vast hallucination, bad meningitis, I get it. And that's what I tried to tell my son. He had been at the bedside while I was deep in coma. He knew something very unusual was going on. And he told me, write everything down before you read anyone else's near-death account. So I forced myself. I didn't read any near-death experiences, and I just wrote down about 20,000 words over 5 to 6 weeks of my memories of my deep experience.
There are very interesting corollaries for people that have had experiences with non-human intelligence or UAP, UFOs, and those that have had near-death or other forms of out-of-body experience. In reporting that there seems to be some layer of reality that we can't often perceive that is just right around us all the time. And we have a problem discussing this. People say, oh, it's like some other dimension, or it's some higher dimension. And then somebody will inevitably say, well, what is a dimension? How can you say that it's a dimension? And how can you possibly know that it's higher than ours?
When a physicist or a neurosurgeon has an experience, you listen to them. But when an ordinary person has such an experience, you don't listen to them. And I'm like, why? Why? It's the same experience. The answer to the why is it's the culture. It's how knowledge is being constructed at that particular moment and how authority is being delegated. But it actually has nothing to do with the actual experiences or with what's being communicated.
We have to get to a common point because there are so many millions of people that had experiences of some just adjacent realm to ours. And by merely putting experiencers of one modality near experiencers of another modality, that conversational chain opens up.
The near-death experience is of interest to those of us who are involved in examining these edgy topics in human function. Some of the cases are very famous and known, and some of them are absolutely staggering. For example, someone who is blind from birth, never saw anything. During a cardiac arrest, describes the experience of lifting out of the body and seeing things, and then describing them in detail. I mean, as a physicist, I can't even imagine. In principle, I would think, well, unless your brain has been, processed to interpret optical images, I mean, I can't even imagine how that could occur, but that was pretty compelling.
The pre-coma me would have said basically that the brain takes sensory input, like from eyes, ears, touch, balance systems, etc., assembles that in kind of a version of the now involving the physical body, but then you have access to memories of all the events you've been through. And the piece I would have missed tremendously that I know now since my coma is very real are the aspects of conscious awareness and information access that go beyond the ken of our physical senses.
All of that speaks to the issue that we are somehow connected. And as a quantum physicist, I say, quantum entanglement, We're somehow connected to the universe around us well beyond what we usually take cognizance of just based on our typical five senses.
A Las Vegas businessman is plopping down $1 million to find out if there is evidence of an afterlife. Space entrepreneur Robert Bigelow has announced the creation of a new institute that is devoted to research into whether human consciousness survives physical death.
Robert Bigelow is an entrepreneur. He has made most of his money in real estate and hotels, and he's done a lot of work in the aerospace area. He just a few years ago decided to turn his attention and his resources toward investigating the evidence for survival of death.
Robert Bigelow's been interested in UFOs for a very long time, I think since he was a young man, basically. And he decided to offer financial support to the study of UFOs, and he set up a group called the National Institute for Discovery Science. NIDS is the abbreviation, in which he brought together some of the best people in the field, among them people like Hal Puthoff and Jacques Vallée and a lot of people we're familiar with today.
And that's where I met people like Whitley Strieber, John Mack, and of course Jacques and I were part of that.
Mr. Bigelow's had a long-standing interest in paranormal phenomena and UFO or alien-type phenomena and the paranormal aspects of this.
If you sort of trace it back, it is a lot of the same people. I mean, Harry Reid knew Bob Bigelow. I think he influenced Harry Reid. He also was the contractor, not surprisingly, that worked for the ATIP program at the Pentagon that Harry Reid set up.
As it turns out, Robert Bigelow separately set up something called Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. He decided to put up a lot of money, I mean millions of dollars, to investigate near-death experience.
Why is it important that somebody like Robert Bigelow, somebody with the means that Robert Bigelow has, that he's providing the funding for this kind of research?
There isn't funding anywhere else. Private individuals, especially private individuals with means, are some of the only people who are willing to take a risk on this because they're not worried about their reputation. So they have the freedom to take risks, to go in experimental, edgy directions. There's not that kind of willingness to explore within the business world. In the world of startups, like we think about people taking risks and, you know, trying new technologies, but even that all is super conservative compared to doing this kind of research.
When you lose loved ones, it does provoke that question, well, did they survive? And it's happened to me. Robert Bigelow has had tragedy in his family. He's lost some loved ones, including his wife. And so, yeah, I think absolutely it's not just an intellectual quest, it's a very personal quest.
Just a few months ago, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the chief of AARO, resigned. This is the #1 UFO hunter for the government, trying to make sense of all this. And he did take a parting shot on the way out the door at a group of people who all know each other for decades, who are kind of at the tipping point of this new world we're in.
It's unfortunate that he felt a need to do that.
That's Mellon. That's Valet.
Mm-hmm.
Tough. We've talked about it, right?
Yeah, but those people were only the catalyst. They aren't the ones still moving the narrative, right? So all those people have done, I mean this in a positive way, they brought others in. Others who've looked at the data and said this is worth studying.
This morning, the former leader of the Pentagon's UFO tracking division is casting some doubt on the existence of alien craft.
Sean Kirkpatrick is the former director of AARO, and he's since retired, but he's been doing some press.
After the hearing, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick refuted Grush's claims in a letter published on his personal LinkedIn page. He wrote, AARO has yet to find any credible evidence to support the allegations of a reverse engineering program for non-human technology.
Sean Kirkpatrick put a negative spin on it and said, well, there's just this group of groupies who are, big on UFOs and ETs and so on, and they just keep talking to each other and sharing data back and forth. That's the scientific method. Nothing wrong with that. So there's kind of a disconnect there between his statement about it versus the people who are actually involved.
And yet at the same time, AARO, the office that he oversaw, published that there's a number of cases that we don't understand, including these metal balls that seem to be flying around our battlefields. And they say, we can't figure it out, but we're going to tell you it's not ET, because we haven't proven it. But it's still moving in ways that we don't know how to do it. What else do you call it?
If you want to solve this mystery, if you want to get to the bottom of this, the best thing you could possibly do would be to get the U.S. intelligence community to take this on, to find answers, because they have capabilities that are exquisite. We have just insane sort of capabilities that the public often doesn't know about, but we've got satellites in geosynchronous orbit, in low Earth orbit, in highly elliptical orbits, and things under the ocean, and air platforms, and new generations of things. We have 17 different space surveillance capabilities. Nobody in the science world has capabilities like that. And I think that gives us hope that within our lifetimes, we may really get to the bottom of this.
It's clear to me at a very high level, and we're talking the National Security Council and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that both of them have directed, we do not want to disclose all that we know about UAP. So that is reflected in the latest AARO report, for example, and what Sean Kirkpatrick is now saying and coming out. I'm sure he has some alignment or association with those two offices. It seems to me that he is part of the disinformation campaign. And it's clear the government does not want to disclose.
Well, they can say it's not a UFO because maybe they've identified it. And they know that what it is, right?
We're in some kind of a race, and the race is with destiny, human destiny, and the destiny of whoever or whatever is here. You have the Defense Department resisting every step of the way because they've got so much to hide, and the embarrassment when the truth comes out is going to be, to say the least, fantastic.
Imagine if you did have a recovered craft. It'd be something the equivalent of taking something back to, the 1700s and dropping them a brand new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. But they ain't gonna figure out. And they're not gonna figure out the gasoline, they're not gonna figure out anything. They might kick it over and it, boom, and kicks off. But and that's sort of like where we're at right now.
Some people think, oh, the government has the full picture and they just don't want to tell us. I think it's just as likely they're reluctant to tell us what they know because of a lack of knowledge. It's because they don't have the answers, and it scares them because it's like, where is this stuff from? We don't really know.
I have classified military information on this captured flying saucer that's fully intact, fully functional.
Can you say anything
yes,
else?
There's a limit. I got to be very careful.
Can we go all the way to the limit?
Well, that's pretty much the limit, and I got to be careful.
Regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C. with the disclosure narrative, and who knows where that's going to go, the cat has been let out of the bag. I think that there is a growing number of people who are picking this up as a real legitimate line of inquiry. These are anthropologists and, religious studies people and philosophers. We're seeing people teaching UFO classes in colleges. And so this is a brand new world.
We should be constructing the arguments in a way that will convince the public that we're serious about it. You can't claim a scientific conclusion if you don't produce the science that you used to come to the conclusion for other people to verify. Otherwise, it's just an anecdote. You are passing off as truth a story.
I actually don't think we'll ever get a scientific model for this because it's not science. We can go outside right now and I can try to prove to you that there are stars in the sky, and you'll just look at me like, you're crazy. And if we couldn't go out at night, if we were bound to noon, you would win the argument every single time. So it's actually the context that matters. It's not me telling you there are stars in the sky. You won't ever believe me because there's no way to go out at night in that model. And so that's really what we need. We need a way to go out at night and look at the stars, and we just don't have that yet. Science is restricted to the sun, to cognitive reason and the senses. And this is about altered states that we don't actually know how to study because they don't follow those rules.
It may be that all of these experiences, whether it's a UFO encounter, whether it's so-called poltergeist activity, whether it's a near-death experience, or reflections or snapshots in a certain sense of this extra physical field in which the psyche participates. From my perspective, it's a very exciting time because we're experiencing not only the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, but the conversation around UFOs and the conversation around the psychical or the extra-physical are starting to converge. And that's a hallmark of our time.